Good morning, evening, or afternoon, depending on when you are tuning into this, the latest episode of our Susty Talk video series, the series designed to keep you guys connected during lockdown and beyond, which is where we seem to be heading right now. For today's episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Ed Cox from the West Midlands Combined Authority. How are you doing today, Ed?
I'm great, thank you very much.
And whereabouts are you dialing in from? I think are you at home?
Yeah, that's right. As many people, I've been at home now for best part of 4 months, and so got completely used to that, and it's an efficient way of working.
Mm-hmm. I was going to ask how you and your team have been working during lockdown, but you've already answered that a little bit.
Yeah, it's been, as I say, it's been a strange time not being able to meet people face to face in quite the same way as we used to, and we're still abiding by the guidelines and working from home. But it's also actually been, I think, a pretty efficient time for those of us that are fortunate to work in the, let's call it, knowledge economy. Then the ability to be able to jump on calls to do things like this pretty easily, I think is fantastic. Obviously, I'm concerned that that's not true for everybody, and there's still a great sense that the crisis is still with us. But it's been a really constructive and an interesting time.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And we're on the call today because the authority recently put out its Green COVID-19 Recovery Plan, which, as far as I'm aware, was the first green recovery plan to come from a local authority. If anyone isn't aware of this announcement, you can look that up on our website. It's essentially aligned with a 2041 net zero target for the region, which we have covered before. So it'd be great to get some more insight on how that framework was developed.
Yeah, well, for those that don't know, the West Midlands Combined Authority encompasses primarily 7 Met areas in the West Midlands, 7 local authorities in the West Midlands, and we've got an Energy and Environment Board, and that is responsible for the work that we do on both climate change and energy more broadly. And towards the end of last year, 2019, we did a fairly extensive consultation on our plans for hitting net zero by 2041. And just as the consultation came to an end, we obviously then hit the COVID-19 crisis. So we were pulling together a strategy anyway around how we address climate change in the West Midlands. But what we felt that we could do was, and what I think everybody's had to do, was to, if you like, reposition that strategy in relation to COVID-19. And I think we're all familiar with the fact that there's been, I think, a debate, though I think it's very difficult to argue against it, that actually the recovery process, whatever that looks like, needs to be a green recovery. And so we have just placed our sort of strategic planning, if you like, in that recovery context. And I think that's really important. I think for all, many people will say yes, that there needs to be a green recovery, and we've obviously consulted with the public and others, and they've all been telling us a very similar message. I think there is still a great risk that over the next 12 months, we could easily have a high carbon rebound as everybody wants to jump back on planes again, and oil might be particularly cheap, and so on and so forth. So I think it's really important that we don't lose sight of the fact that climate change continues to be a really urgent issue, and to marry, if you like, the two crises together.
Mm-hmm. A lot of the measures, though, do seem to be behaviour changes and things that people are enjoying. So there's a lot there on electric vehicles and on active transport, which will minimise air pollution, and then on retrofitting and energy efficiency, which the government has since backed, saying it's a really quick way of getting people to work in low carbon sectors.
That's right. I mean, I think both in narrative terms, but also actually very practically as well, many aspects of our green recovery strategy, if you want to call it that, our 2041 strategy, have perhaps had a slightly different emphasis because of COVID-19. I think the need to do retrofits, just to use that example, was there before the crisis. But I think now it becomes all the more urgent and important, because we know that it will, if it's targeted properly, it could benefit those who are most fuel poor and possibly most vulnerable to a second wave of COVID. We know that it can generate a significant number of green jobs. We know that it can address other health and social outcomes. So I think, the intention would be there anyway in terms of our approach to tackling climate change, but the COVID-19 crisis has perhaps amplified the way in which we've helped us focus on certain priorities. I mean, I think it's very interesting too that you mentioned the way in which many people, and it's not everybody, so we need to be clear about this, but many people have been able to enjoy cleaner air, and they've been able to enjoy their daily walks and have perhaps become more appreciative of their natural environment. And again, that means that for a strategy like the one we're developing, which has a kind of clear natural capital element to it, there has been, if you like, a receptive public to some of the things that we might want to do. And so to that extent, again, I think, the COVID-19 crisis has, if you like, prefigured the kind of world that we might actually want when it comes to parks and green spaces. And, to that extent, we've played into that.
Mm-hmm. Great. And then you talked a bit about how the board had been working on this pre-pandemic and how they'd adapted afterwards. It would be good to hear about the region-specific context that was put into this net zero target and plan for achieving it, because we all know that the West Midlands has a really extensive local history of manufacturing and as an industrial hub.
Yeah. Well, I think I'd make the general point that, place and the way in which we understand any local authority, or in our case, combined authority, a regional scale, is absolutely critical to the way in which we're going to tackle climate change. We need to have a really deep understanding of the kind of economy, the kind of places that we're dealing with, and so to that extent, any climate change strategy, and so certainly the one in the West Midlands, needs to be place specific, and we need to consider what can be done at different spatial scales to ensure that we are, if you like, contributing to net zero targets. I think in the West Midlands, given some of the sort of economic challenges that we've had in recent times, we've been very clear that it needs to be a just transition, that we don't leave anybody behind, that the transition that we need to make boosts the resilience of local people and communities, and indeed the whole region. But I think too, what we've tried to emphasise is that we can actually use our industrial past to create a new future. I think people see the West Midlands as being the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, and from a carbon point of view, that's perhaps not such a great claim to make as we look at it from sort of the 2020 perspective. But I think what it means is that we can actually make some really big and important transitions. If I take, for example, the energy intensive industries that we have in the Black Country, then we want to be the kind of pilot region for where we make that shift away from energy intensive industry to much cleaner futures. And there's a whole set of ideas we've got about how we would go about doing that. When we think about the West Midlands as being the region that has, if you like, been at the forefront of the car industry and the automotive industry in the country, then we want to be the place now that is absolutely pioneering and championing the role of electric vehicles. And we've got plans for a gigafactory to produce batteries. So I think what I'm saying here is that there is a industrial heritage in the West Midlands that makes it almost the perfect setting for a new green revolution. And there's all kinds of examples of where we can, if you like, take that old approach to industry and innovation and enterprise and actually transform it through a very new approach and a revolutionary approach here in the West Midlands.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have my fingers crossed. I was tuned into the Bays committee hearings last week, and from what I can gather, there's going to be a lot more information about industrial decarbonisation coming out this autumn. So everything crossed for that after the announcements earlier this month.
Sure. Yeah.
Great. And I have to ask, because I'm sure we'll have a lot of other local authorities watching this, and at the time that I'm recording this, just today, I've had two universities, UCL and Goldsmiths, email me to say they're developing low carbon recovery plans as well. So I have to ask whether you think that the 2041 plan from the West Midlands could be a blueprint for other public sector bodies.
It's a good question. I think first, let me say, I think going back to what I said before, there's a little bit of a risk about talking about blueprints. I think that yes, we're very proud of what we're doing here. We think that we're playing something of a leadership role in relation to combined authorities and local authorities across England, at least, and so that's right. But going back to what I said about place, every climate change strategy needs to be specific to its own place. So, I mean, you talked about industrial decarbonisation. That may not be the issue for every region, and therefore their climate change strategy will need to be a little bit different. But I do think that the collaborative approach that we're trying to adopt here, recognising that it's not just the combined authority itself, it's a whole range of other organisations, businesses, local authorities and so on that are really going to be key to this. I think that's something that other areas could consider, that collaborative role. And I think the other point I'd make in this regard is that I know that the other combined authorities, whether that's Greater Manchester or North of Tyne or Sheffield City region, they're all working on their own approaches, and there's a lot to be learned between them. And so I wouldn't necessarily sort of say, oh well, the West Midlands is best, everybody come and copy us. I would say, okay, what can we all learn from one another? And I could say that about local authorities as well. There's absolutely fantastic work going on across different local authorities, and that needs to be shared and learned. So I think, yes, we have a blueprint, or yes, we have a strategy and approach, but there's clearly a lot of scope for us to continue to improve that.
So context, collaboration and continued learning really are the key words there.
Well, you've summed it up beautifully. Yeah, that's fantastic. I'll steal that myself.
Yeah, put that as your tagline. Great. Well, that's my last question for today, but thank you so much for joining me, Ed.
No problem at all.
And thank you everyone for tuning in. Just your regular reminder that this is a continuing series, so fear not, there will be more episodes, and the rest of our episodes are also live for you to browse through on our YouTube and our website. So until the next edition, stay well, stay safe, and keep up the susty talk.